And yes, welcome back from that short break that we got right there. And yes, before, like I said, we're going to have a very special conversation with a guest, and her name is Emma Impink, that is going to actually take us through, the topic is conservation and community development. So Emma has been working for African Parks for more than, 16 years or so, if I'm not really, if I'm meant to believe in it. So if you are watching us, of course, the conversation is going to get much better when you really put in your comment and try to ask your question as well to know exactly what is the role of African parks in South Sudan in particular, which is where we are in community development. So Emma Payne, welcome to the Morning Echo.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just to clarify, I've been living and working in East Africa for 15 years, but working with African Parks just for 1 year. We work across 14 countries and 24 protected areas in South Sudan, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Chad. We sign long-term agreements with governments who invite us to come and manage protected areas on behalf of the nation to build capacity and protect wildlife.
Wow, that's beautiful, by the way. That's a huge, you have understood Africa, let's say East Africa, more than most of the people that are here, because more than 15 years is such a long time. That's a decade and a half, or close to 2 decades. That's really beautiful. Of course, we would like to really know, people who are just somewhere watching right now would really want to understand who is Emma and what exactly is Emma role in South Sudan when it comes to African parks that you are actually currently working for.
So African Parks has signed a 10-year MOU, a renewable MOU with the Ministry of Wildlife Conservation and Tourism to support and manage 2 protected areas, Badingilo National Park and Boma National Park, but also to manage what we call the wildlife migration corridors between those national parks. South Sudan has the largest mammal migration in the world, especially our white-eared kob and our tiang that move throughout that ecosystem, which we call the Great Nile Migration. So African Parks is working with the Ministry of Wildlife Conservation and Tourism to sort of increase the operational efficacy of those parks and to make sure that wildlife are able to continue moving between the parks on the land that communities live on. The wildlife, the kob and the tiang, depend on water and grass, which is within that area, the same water and grass that pastoralists depend on. And so it's really important that we keep those areas managed well with enough water and grass, but also that wildlife and livestock can continue to move. So I work on the community development team, which is working to make sure that the communities that live around the national parks and live in these wildlife corridors benefit from wildlife.
Wow, that's amazing, of course. What actually inspired you to dedicate your career to community development, actually?
I really care about wildlife and the environment, but we can't separate people from that environment. I think as humans, we all love nature and are impacted by nature, and so the way that I've chosen to contribute to wildlife conservation and protection of the environment is by working with the communities who take care of it and steward it. We have such amazing wildlife and ecosystems in Africa because people have lived alongside that wildlife for millennia.
Wow, that's amazing, by the way. And of course, when you look at the situation right now, wildlife is very important for a lot of countries. But yes, for countries that are in conflict, it's a bit complicated in many ways. We are not really getting the best out of our wildlife system. Now, was there a defining movement that actually made you choose conservation over the development sectors?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I've always wanted to connect the work that I've been doing to the environment. And I think, to me, conservation and development are 2 sides of the same coin. And I think we need to see protection of wildlife and protection of the environment as a way that people can develop. So often conservation is seen as something separate. National parks that have a fence that local communities can't be a part of. And that's a really kind of outdated way of thinking about conservation. Conservation needs to be participatory. Communities are vital stakeholders and really need to be a part of it.
Wow. That's actually interesting. And well, of course, when it comes to working with communities, there are a lot of challenges that normally comes up. And you might have actually faced them. These challenges could be, environmental. They could be, of course, people-related kind of issues. How do you handle all these things?
Well, I'm never working alone, always working with a great team. And I think it's really important to seek to understand what the context and situations are for communities, particularly communities that are living near protected areas or living near wildlife. You can't just go in and assume that because you understand the wildlife, you understand the communities. It's easy to map out where animals move and what water they need, but it's a lot harder to understand the history and complexity of communities. So you really need to sit and listen. I think it's really important to understand what systems and assets communities have, and how those can be used for conservation or for development, instead of coming in and assuming that something is missing and it needs to be fixed. I like to start by understanding what is present in communities and then building off of that.
Wow, that's amazing. Looking back for over 15 years, what has been your biggest lesson in this field?
Never trust your first idea. I think, it's easy to come into a situation and say, oh, I have a solution to this challenge. But you always need to keep thinking and thinking and thinking and revising and revising. So I've gotten very good at, trying a solution. It doesn't work. You have to start again from square one. But that's how this work gets done.
Right. Okay, you've worked in several African countries. How has each experience shaped your understanding of communities and conservation?
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to work in Tanzania, Kenya, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, Mozambique, and now South Sudan. Each one is different in terms of culture and historical context, but I think there are common themes, which is, communities have so much knowledge and understanding of how to steward and protect natural resources. And they get frustrated when governments or NGOs don't acknowledge that knowledge or don't acknowledge those systems. And so I think, that's a lesson that continues to be reinforced for me is communities have a lot of potential and often have the tools and systems. They just need time and resources to be enabled to enact them.
Wow. And which country actually presented the most unique challenges?
I think all of the challenges are, different in their own way. I think I would say the challenges and opportunities are really big here in South Sudan. There are so many different, it's just a big moment of dynamism for the country, but we have a really unique opportunity to build policies and to learn from all of our neighbors. I think, the work that I've done in Tanzania and Kenya is often trying to figure out how can we make the government systems work for communities in conservation. Here in South Sudan, we're writing the policy to make that possible right now. And so we should be learning from, the lessons that Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda are teaching us. And our new wildlife conservation and protected areas law really empowers communities to make decisions around conservation, which is exciting. But because we're writing so much policy at the same time, it's really important that that policy is all coordinated. So much of wildlife conservation depends on land tenure, and there's a lot of complexity about land here in South Sudan.
Wow. With the communities that you actually worked with, what are similarities and the differences that you actually have seen so far?
That's an interesting question. I think I've been lucky to work in a lot of pastoral systems, so systems where people depend on livestock. It's really important to those communities that they're able to move. It's important to those communities that they're able to protect their livestock against predators. In terms of agricultural communities, they're obviously more sedentary and more concerned about access to water and trying to make sure that they can protect their livestock against wildlife. But I think, there are similarities in terms of families wanting to make decisions that will enable them to take care of their children and enable them to protect their resources and plan for a better future.
Wow, that's really actually amazing. Being, in Africa, mostly in South Sudan, many South Sudanese have had the name African Parks, but may not really understand what the organization does, what is African Parks, and what makes it a model, what makes its model different.
Yeah, so African Parks has been working on the continent for more than 20 years, and what we've really sort of made our name from is helping to manage protected areas. So often national parks are established, but they're not so well run in terms of maintaining the roads, in terms of building infrastructure, in terms of finding opportunities for tourism. And we've assembled a team that are really experts on infrastructure and operations, but then also with a lot of unique knowledge about conservation science and how to monitor and manage populations. Looking at wildlife is very similar to looking after your herd of cows. You want to make sure that the population is healthy. You want to make sure that there's not too much disease, that they have access to water and fodder. And so that's really where African Parks built its experience in Southern Africa. And then because of our success, we started getting invited into landscapes that had a bit more complexity. Places like Chad or Central African Republic, where governments were dealing with a lot of issues and also wanted to look at protecting their natural resources alongside building their economies and protecting their populations. Here in South Sudan is a really exciting opportunity for African Parks because we're not just protecting and supporting national parks, we're also supporting a landscape. The Great Nile migration won't be able to survive if we only protect Boma and Badingilo National Park. The migration has to be able to move, which means communities are essential to that conversation because animals spend more than 70% of their time outside of protected areas on community land. So we really need to make sure that communities see the benefit of protecting this wildlife and keeping this wildlife mobile. So I think, the work that we do as African Parks, we've spent the last couple of years really trying to understand this migration, how it moves, how much wildlife is here, what are its critical habitats, where are the areas that the animals find water during the dry season, where are the areas where animals give birth in the rainy season, and then how can we protect those key areas of the landscape so that we can continue supporting the migration.
Wow, before we move on to the next question, people would have zero knowledge about how things work in the wild, don't really understand. How do you map out that these population of animals are actually having some disease that you need to actually come in and try to help? How do you really actually find out all this?
Yeah, so in South Sudan, and particularly in the landscape that we work in, we do a lot of our monitoring by aircraft, by airplane, because there aren't roads in our ecosystem. So we do a lot of flying and take a lot of photos. And then by analyzing those photos with our data teams, we're able to look at wildlife and start to determine demographics. So how many males and females are in the population? Is it a breeding population? Are they having babies? And we do aerial surveys every couple of years to count the populations and see how they're behaving. We're still trying to understand some of those bigger questions here in South Sudan. So far, the populations of antelope are quite healthy. We haven't seen so much disease work. In some of the smaller parks where you can drive around, it's possible to know individual elephants and individual giraffe. And then you can look at them and see, are they healthy? How are they doing? And sort of check them over time. The same way that you would check your cows, and see like, oh, this one doesn't look so good. I wonder if he's sick.
That's really great, by the way. And looking at the population, the massive migration of animals from South Sudan to the neighboring countries. really, we don't understand how this works when it comes to differentiating the animals that belong to this country and the one that belong to the next. So, as people working for African Park, do you really have some, ways of detecting that this is not from here and this is from there?
Yeah, unfortunately, most of the migration in South Sudan is not really moving into other countries anymore. In the southeastern part of the country, we did have, elephants and wildlife moving into Uganda and to Kenya, but there's a lot of human population in those areas now, and animals tend to not move through areas of deep human population. So there's not really what we would call a viable corridor between Kenya and Uganda anymore. A little bit between Ethiopia and South Sudan around Akobo, we see animals moving across the border, but there's not as much trans-boundary wildlife movement because of human populations. Most of the wildlife that we have, particularly in this Great Nile migration landscape, stays within South Sudan.
Okay, looking at what is happening, like the occupation of of the land that used to be a wildlife and inhabitant. For example, animals left the country going to Uganda, Kenya mostly for that case. And then when they come back, they find out that there is no way of coming back because the whole land has been actually occupied. Really, what do you do on that? Okay.
Well, it's not necessarily that the whole land has been occupied, but I think that people are moving in different areas. And this is something that, we're working with the Ministry of Wildlife Conservation and Tourism to understand which corridors are still open and which corridors are closed. Animals are pretty dynamic. They can change their behavior depending on what they see, particularly animals like elephants, who over generations share information about safe migration routes. Mothers will teach their daughters and daughters will teach their daughters. And where's the safe place? Where is there water? Where is there good food? A group of elephants is led by a very strong female called the matriarch, and she's the one who makes the decisions about where animals go. And so that knowledge is stored over generations, and so elephants will remember places that they can move for a really long time. It's not necessarily that once humans live in an area, the corridor won't stay open. But it is something that, is important and part of managing a system over time.
Wow, that's really amazing. How does African Park work with the government, and how do you balance wildlife protection with the community interest?
Yeah, great question. So we work really closely with the Ministry of Wildlife Conservation and Tourism, both at the national level and at the states and local levels. Also, we work within the Greater Pibor Administrative Area, so we work with wildlife representatives there as well. A lot of discussion, a lot of collaboration. We develop our work plans together with the Ministry of Wildlife Conservation and Tourism, with their experts. So we're constantly collaborating and sharing information. In terms of balancing wildlife conservation and community needs, I think that's really the most important question that is central to conservation today, and that's what I spend most of my time thinking about. How can a national park or how can a protected area enable communities to benefit and to meet their needs? Something that's really exciting that the new Wildlife Conservation and Protected Areas Bill is making possible in South Sudan is something called a community conservancy, where communities decide to establish an area of protection on their land, an area that communities manage together with, in this case, the National Wildlife Service that has wildlife. And it's an area that communities could establish a small tourism project on, or areas that communities could use their wildlife sustainably. But it's a way for communities to be closer to the management of wildlife. Usually national parks and game reserves are managed by the government, managed by the state. And those are areas of really extreme protection, so they're areas that typically don't allow human activity. Game reserves enable a little bit of human activity like seasonal grazing or grass collection. But a community conservancy is where people are living alongside wildlife and where communities are able to benefit directly. So we're kind of, in that case, trying to break down the wall between conservation as being something separate from communities and trying to bring it together. I've worked in a lot of community conservancies in northern Kenya. Our neighbor has done a lot of work on developing conservancies. It's been something that Kenya has been working on for the last 30 years, and so we have a lot of opportunity to learn from them.
That's actually amazing. What, of course, is African Park currently doing in South Sudan in particular?
Yeah, so we have a team that's working in Badingilo National Park and a team that's working in Boma National Park, and then a team that's here in Juba. In Badingilo and Boma, we're doing a lot of monitoring and trying to map and understand the wildlife movements, identify those key populations, try to understand where key habitats are for elephants and lions, and then also trying to understand, again, where those big ungulate populations, the white-eared cub and the tiang, are moving. We are working with the government on law enforcement, so trying to make sure that the new wildlife law is clear and well understood by the communities who live around. We're building ranger forces to protect the protected areas, working with the government to make sure that the areas are demarcated, and then doing a lot of community engagement work, understanding how communities use the land, understanding community challenges and opportunities. We're supporting schools, paying teacher salaries, and trialing some small livelihood products and projects to see if communities can diversify their livelihood source. In Jonglei in particular, there's a lot of illegal and unsustainable hunting of bushmeat, often because communities don't have an alternative source of livelihood. So that's something that we're really trying to work on, make better alternatives so that people don't have to hunt to feed their families.
That's a great one. Which regions are you focusing on, and what are the priorities actually?
Yeah, so I work on the western side of the landscape. I'm based in Badingilo National Park. So, I work with communities in central Equatoria State and then a little bit in Terekeka County. And then I also work in western Jonglei in Bor South, Twitch East, and Duke County. I have a counterpart on the community development team who works in Boma. And so she works throughout GPAA and then also in Otalo and Pochala. So we work with a lot of different, there's so many different communities there, and each one has its own priority areas and aspects, but we've been really trying to map out, how are communities using natural resources, what are their challenges, and how can we support them.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, of course, community development is at the center of your work. What does that mean in practical terms?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're always trying to think about how the park, in Badingilo, how the park can be seen as a positive force on people's lives. So part of that is looking at ways that the park can support communities and how the park can have a positive influence. So, making sure that we're supporting enterprise and education. In Jonglei, where we don't have a national park, we're really trying to figure out how communities can benefit from wildlife protection. So either through establishing community conservancies or using traditional governance systems to manage wildlife. We're, in Badingilo and in the sort of western side of the landscape, always thinking about opportunities to bring tourists to see this incredible wildlife. In the western side of the landscape, we have the River Nile, and thinking about boat trips. A lot of people will visit Terekeka, and we have some really beautiful habitat, and there are also Mundari communities on the eastern side of the river in places like Chimeza and Sudan Safari. So we'd love to see some of that cultural tourism come and expand into environmental tourism. Our colleagues in Boma National Park have opened a small camp, Marwa Hills, where we're also trying to do some tourism. Right now, to get the best view of the migration is pretty much by aircraft. because to really appreciate the expanse of it, it's great to see it from the sky. But I think we have some really exciting opportunities to look at how communities can benefit from tourism and from wildlife.
Great. Are there some projects that are transforming communities that you could give some examples of?
Well, we're paying salaries for 48 teachers on the western side of the landscape. Priority schools that have been identified by communities. In Lafayette County, we're working with a small group of leaders who formed the Lafayette Community Education Committee, making decisions about which schools are most in need for teachers and teacher support. And then we've also spoken with leaders in Mangala and in Jimeza to understand where teachers need salaries. Parents have said to us that education and particularly paying teachers is their main goal, so that's something that we've really been working on. In terms of Njongole, in South County, we've been meeting with chiefs and PIAM administrators to understand what step communities can take to protect wildlife. And the chiefs in Bor South have implemented a ban on using PKMs for hunting wildlife to try and minimize the negative impact that hunting has in that community. And that's been something that communities are working on enforcing themselves alongside the ministry and the National Wildlife Service.
And that is exactly what they call, local people participation in decision making.
It's the only way to do it if you want solutions to be sustainable. Things need to be owned and driven by the community. If they're pushed just by outsiders, it's not going to work. And so I think our most important task is to make sure that communities feel that there's a benefit and there's a reason to protect wildlife. If it's just something that they're being told without evidence, it won't work.
Exactly. Yeah, some people believe, conservation limits communities' access to natural resources. How do you respond to that concern?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's a really legitimate concern. That's why it's so important that community voices are heard and we fully map out traditional natural resource systems when we're establishing management plans or when we're establishing new protected areas. A national park and a game reserve and protected areas in general have to work for the communities around them. So for example, a management plan of a national park should take into account what are traditional uses of the area, and then to see if those traditional uses are compatible with the conservation goals. So for example, if communities, which happens a lot in Badingilo National Park, if communities want to collect grass for thatching, that's something that is very manageable. And that there should be days where communities are invited into the park or into the buffer zone to collect that grass. Now, what doesn't work is if people set snares and hunt wildlife alongside of cutting the grass. So it then needs to be a compromise. Communities can come in and collect grass as long as they don't hunt or set fires or do things that are destructive to the overall purpose of the park, which is protecting the wildlife. So I think it's all about having a discussion. Same thing about people moving cows through parks and even grazing. I think, if there can be a respectful and equitable discussion between local leaders and management of parks or game reserves, it should be possible to figure out how to do these things. The problem is when there are spoilers or when there are individuals who come in and try to push the envelope or take too much.
Definitely looking at the people normally graze their cattle along the park. And sometimes this is like, they have to go out and get extra food by hunting. That's where poaching becomes a serious case. How do you really address that problem when it comes to, communities moving to the park, as pastoralists especially, and then they did those activities?
Yeah, we have enough wildlife in South Sudan that what we call sustainable offtake or sustainable hunting is possible. And we're working with the government right now in the Wildlife Conservation and Protected Areas Law. There are provisions for communities to hunt legally. It just needs to be done under what's called a quota system, where communities are hunting certain amounts of wildlife at certain times. The problem is when it's unregulated and when it's unmanaged. Lots of times you have people hunting with heavy automatic rifles, which kills a lot of animals. They only end up taking 4 or 5 back, which means there are others that are dying and that are uncollected, so it's a waste. Also, when you're hunting with big heavy machinery, it's hard to know if you're killing males or females. Also, sometimes you can kill infants This is one of the big challenges with snares. When people put wire or rope down and animals get caught in the snare and then die. A snare is what we call a non-selective method of hunting. So females, pregnant females, infants can get killed also.
Yeah, sure.
It's important that, we're selectively harvesting wildlife. And so I think, it's a question of making those management plans together with communities. Talking with pastoralists, nobody would ever kill a female cow that was pregnant.
Yeah,
no,
they don't.
Everybody understands how those systems and how herd management works. So it's just a question of making that connection and then helping people make decisions. Again, the hunters that I've spoken to, it's a last resort because they're other economic challenges that are preventing them from having other livelihoods. And so it's also our responsibility as conservationists, if we're asking people to protect wildlife, we need to make that a possible pathway for them.
That's interesting. How do you build trust with communities, and have you ever faced resistance, and how do you address that problem?
Time, spending a lot of time showing up, having discussions, being respectful. It's really important that you don't come in thinking that you know everything and that you don't come in explaining things. I think where you reach resistance is communities that have been disappointed by expectations and broken promises in the past. It's really important that when you're speaking with communities, you're really managing expectations. Because South Sudan has had so much hardship, there are a lot of humanitarian organizations which play a really important role in terms of helping people get out of crisis. But humanitarian organizations can sometimes create an expectation. And so when you're trying to build more sustainable long-term solutions, that sort of short-term thinking that comes out from humanitarian organizations can create a culture of frustration around longer-term solutions. So it's really just about trust and building relationships and showing people that you're really with them for the long term.
Wow. What role do women and young people play in conservation and community development?
Central. Women are the ones who are taking care of their families and often making the natural resource decisions about where are we getting water, where are we getting firewood, where are we getting food. Women are also, in so many cultures, the keeper of education for their children. So it's women who can, help shape the future conservationists. In terms of youth, as young people grow up to become citizens of their nation, they're the ones who are going to be making decisions. So they need to understand the consequences of those decisions. Also, they're the ones who are going to be, trying to manage the mistakes that we've made. And so, they're absolutely the future. And again, because women have a direct role of teaching and supporting them, they're really at the heart of the work of conservation.
Wow. Are there some specific program targeting youth? And of course, how can young South Sudanese, become involved?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a lot of fantastic programs. We are often in collaboration and in conversation trying to figure out how we can bring more young learners and students to see the type of work that we're doing. We have a relationship with the University of Juba. We have a relationship with the South Sudan Youth Biodiversity Group. Trying to expose our work and the research that we do to young people in terms of recruitment, in terms of employment. But yeah, it's something that we're really trying to think about how we can do. We want to make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel and trying to plug into organizations that already exist. But it's a big question. I mean, I mostly have young people on my team, and so does my colleague on the Boma side of the landscape. We employ people to do community outreach and engagement, doing education, working with people on livelihood projects, supporting teachers. So we really model that.
Wow, amazing. Of course, we've come to the end of this. Let's go for a quick break. We shall be back and finish the rest of the story, of the questions that we have. Yes.
SteamSat Company Limited, a solution to satellite services like DSTV, StarTimes, LNB all types, subscriptions, free installations. We also do aluminium fabrication to doors, windows, partitioning, suspended ceiling, prefurb, panel cladding, glasses. Call us now on +211 925 068 406 +211 985 068. Email us on bnksolutions@hotmail.com.
Find us on Goodale Road after Pacific Petrol Station on the right hand, just 500 meters from Advance Radio.
With Premier Airlines, major cities in East Africa are now closer to you than you think. Affordable air tickets to any destination within East Africa, with flights among cities like Juba, Nairobi, Mogadishu, and Entebbe, with about 10 flights per week to several destinations with unbeatable prices. Your next journey story starts with Premier Airlines. Contact reservations office on +211 921 0099 or +211 982 300023 or +211 988 251993 or +211 929 389389. Email premierairlinesjuba@gmail.com or premiermarketing-juba2025@gmail.com. For years, we have been the bridge between where you are and where your heart is in East Africa. We value customer care, excellence, and commitment. Premier Airlines, discover the skies.
The harmony between Arabic, Portuguese, Swahili, Fulani, and Amharic. You don't want to miss it.
The game was on fire. Every pass, every goal, every second, unmissable. Then, blackout. But not all screens go dark. One app, one tap, changes everything. With My Home TV, the match never stops. Live, anywhere, anytime. My Home TV. Your TV, always with you.
I've seen some people dropping in their questions through our WhatsApp number. And yeah, one of the persons here actually said, how is African Parks managing medical situation of the wildlife?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, we're trying to do a lot of what we do as aerial surveys. We also have a lot of people moving around the landscape on foot, these community agents and ecological agents who are looking around, checking on wildlife. We work with wildlife vets through the Ministry of Wildlife Conservation and Tourism, if there are any animals that need medical attention.
Wow, that's amazing. What is African Parks doing to minimize poaching activities?
Yeah, great question. We talked a little bit about this, but I think big picture, trying to work on alternative livelihoods so that communities don't only have to turn to poaching. We're also working with the Ministry of Wildlife Conservation and Tourism on developing regulations for the Wildlife Act. So making sure that it's clear what illegal activity is and what permitted activity is. And then we also work with the National Wildlife Service and the ministry on supporting their rangers. We've had some vehicle checkpoints throughout the landscape to try to detect bushmeat moving throughout the area. And then really a lot of community engagement about the importance of protecting wildlife and ways to think about how communities can regulate the amount of hunting and poaching that's happening.
Wow, that's great. You've worked in several countries, of course, including South Sudan. What stands out about South Sudan?
I would say the diversity is really exciting. In terms of how many different communities, ethnic groups, how much people have moved around, the diversity of the landscapes as well, the diversity of the habitat and the different ecosystems. And I would say I haven't really worked in a place that is so new in terms of creating its national identity. It's really exciting to hear people talk about, what they want the future of South Sudan to be, and to have it be such a, open and story that can be led by the people.
Wow, that's really amazing. What could happen if these ecosystems, are not protected?
Yeah, that's a really important question. What's so exciting about South Sudan, and particularly about the landscape where African Parks works, is that this migration is still really healthy and alive. The fact that it can move so much means that it's the animals are at their healthiest. The animals are really accessing diverse gene pools because they're able to breed with animals across the landscape. All big mammal migrations used to be like this. So the wildebeest migration in Serengeti and Masai Mara in Kenya and Tanzania used to be massive. It's been constrained as people and populations have come in and limited the amount of space that it has to occupy, which means that it's not going to be as healthy because it can't. The animals can't find the best grass or the best water, and they can't mate with the most, different members of their population. So as migrations get constrained, or as migrations get broken and populations then become sedentary, they have less options for finding good grass and for finding good water and for diversifying their gene pool, which means then they're more likely to get sick and get disease and other things. So we have this opportunity to keep this migration moving. And the way that we can do that is by making sure that animals have access to the critical dry season water areas and to their grass. We've been working, with the Ministry of Roads and Infrastructure to really make sure that our linear infrastructure, our roads and bridges, are planned with this migration in mind, so that we're not disrupting the migratory pathways too much, or if we are, we're coming up with ways to mitigate the impact of that linear infrastructure. It's much easier to do that from the planning perspective than to try to make corrections. Where I'm from in the United States, we built our road networks without understanding our wildlife movements, and now we are spending huge amounts of money to try and create alternative pathways for wildlife to move. It's much easier to plan your roads knowing where wildlife is, which is the opportunity that we have here in South Sudan.
Amazing. Of course, how can conservation, contribute to economic development?
Yeah, great question. I think kind of the most common way that people think conservation can connect to economic development is tourism, which is definitely one that can happen. But I think there are a lot of other ways that wildlife conservation can support economic development. For example, conserving our fisheries is what allows us to create so much fish. Again, we have so much wildlife that we can start to sustainably harvest it so people can eat the wildlife. If we're really thoughtful and careful about how we do it, we can produce wildlife for commercial meat production, which a lot of countries in Southern Africa do. But there's also really exciting opportunities about, nature-based solutions and finance. The carbon sequestration that happens in the Sud and that happens in this Great Nile migration with all this grassland is massive. And I think from a carbon market and carbon credit perspective, South Sudan has huge potential. That can unlock lots of nature-based finance, which could really contribute massively to our GDP.
Okay, that's really amazing. Well, climate change is affecting communities across Africa. How is it impacting conservation in South Sudan?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the landscape that we work in, the Great Nile Migration, is really impacted by drought and flood. Communities are also impacted by drought and flood, as we know. Climate change exacerbates those drought flood patterns. And just by stressing people's systems and stressing the resilience, it just causes more challenge. When we have massive flooding, which has happened, in Twitch East and in Duk, and happens often in places like Pibor, communities move, livestock moves, wildlife moves, and we have communities coming into conflict. Then we have drought periods where livestock are dying, crops are dying, and animals are really looking for water. When we have conflict around water holes, that's when we have human-wildlife conflict, and also that tends to really drive up incidents of hunting.
That's nice. What practical solutions are communities adopting to?
In terms of climate change, I think we're really working on communities doing things like land use planning. So communities thinking about how they're using their land now, how they want to use their land in the future, and then making plans to support that. So areas, having a plan if there's flooding, areas that they want to keep open and protected. For example, communities that are resettling after flooding, how are they doing that in a way that continues to, keep cattle corridors open and wildlife corridors open? How are they doing that in ways that will continue to keep their areas protected? So it's a lot about forward planning. I think also, about making sure that we're connecting communities with climate smart agriculture, crops that are more resilient, helping with livestock with improved breeds, and just making sure that people have access to the information that they need to make sure their households are resilient. I mean, we just spent 2 days at the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralism policy dialogue, and we talked a lot about how at its core, pastoralism and cattle grazing is a very resilient livelihood strategy because it's mobile and it can respond to threats like flooding and drought. Just like the wildlife, when pastoralists are constrained, they're more at risk from climate.
Okay. How important is community awareness?
Community awareness is essential. Essential about the importance of wildlife, essential about the role that communities play in wildlife, essential about the tools and the policy that we have here in South Sudan. Essential for communities to understand their rights, essential for communities to understand what they can demand from their government. I think awareness is really one of the key pieces. And that's, again, as you said, the role that youth can play. We have to be getting into schools and talking about the importance of wildlife and conservation.
Wow. Many people ask whether conservation can create jobs. What employment opportunities does African Parks create?
Yeah, great question. We're always hiring for people to join our team, things as diverse as mechanics and procurement officers to, people out talking to communities, to people flying in the planes counting wildlife. So there's definitely opportunities for employment. As we continue to explore alternative livelihoods, there's, opportunities for building new economies. Hopefully, as we can continue to build tourism, there'll be work in tourism as well. But again, we really see diversified economies as being a part of this future. It'd be great to see more commercialization and utilization of livestock. It would be great to see more abattoirs and commercial meat production. We have so much range land and cattle fodder here that's a really exciting opportunity. Opportunities to continue to manage our fisheries responsibly. I think there are a lot of ways that conservation and employment can go hand in hand.
Wow. What skills are most needed, and can the local entrepreneur benefit?
Sorry?
What skills are most needed, and can a local entrepreneur actually benefit?
Yeah, good question. I mean, to me, I think the most important skill in conservation is being a good listener. particularly in terms of talking to communities and really being open-minded, and thinking about how the work is done. In terms of skills within the sort of broader conservation mindset, I think, communication and being able to talk about why conservation is important is really critical. I think, also looking, in terms of business management and business skills. I think if we want entrepreneurs to start small enterprises, being competitive, thinking about how they can diversify their market. I think, also building sustainable businesses is going to be really key.
After working across East Africa and Central Africa, what leadership lessons have you stayed with?
Which
leadership skills have you stayed with?
I would say, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but listening is really important. Trying to build consensus, trying to bring people together around shared goals, and patience. I think, when you're working with communities, things take time.
Actually, being a good listener and good communicator is important. Well, what qualities make an effective community leader in terms of people that you normally pick to represent African Parks at community level? And how do you lead multicultural teams?
Yeah. So I think looking for people who work in our team, who work with communities, what's really key is trust. That they're trusted by communities, that communities feel that they listen to them and can represent them, which again I think comes from being seen as being neutral and unbiased. I think also people who, are really respected. Lots of times our community teams are people who engage in enterprise and livelihoods that are similar to what other people do. When I've worked in farming communities, it's great to have community members that are also farmers because they can really speak to some of the challenges, or, people that are also cattle herders. What was your second question?
My second question is, how do you lead multicultural teams?
Oh, yeah. Again, listening, trust. I think what's really important is for us all to recognize that we come from a particular culture, and like the way that you grew up and the way that you were educated is not the objective truth that is the same for everyone. It's your own personal perspective. So what I might think is an effective communicator is maybe different than what you might think is an effective communicator. Because I grew up in a particular place. So I think it's really important to, as a team, create shared expectations and to create shared metrics for success, so that then they become something that's collectively agreed to rather than assumed. In the United States, for example, where I grew up, we tend to value really short, concise communication. In East Africa, lots of times communication is a lot longer, and the person who could speak the longest is seen as the most important. They're different value systems, right? There's not one that's more important than the other. But I think when I have given Tanzanian colleagues feedback about being brief and concise, they've been confused because they grew up in a culture that valued people that could speak for a long time and tell stories. So it's really important that if I'm framing that, feedback, I'm framing it from a cultural context. Hey, we're working for an American organization that has this value of concise communication. That may not be your cultural value, but in this organization, to get ahead, this is the way to adapt. Similarly, I find myself adapting to different work environments where things are different from my culture. But it's important that there's not one that's better than the other. They're just different, and you need to figure out how to adapt from there. For example, I have sometimes been younger than people that I've worked with, people that I've managed, and I've had to work on that relationship of navigating respect.
Wow. What made it, unforgettable? I mean, when it comes to, the answer you just gave, we need to actually know what made you working with people that have different kind of view when it comes to communication. What made it unforgettable, and what did it teach you in particular?
I mean, so many lessons in terms of working across cultures and different communities. I think I'm trying to think of some specific examples. I think coming back to that point that I said earlier, that like your first interpretation of something is not always the best one.
Sure.
And I think also to just be open to the feedback that colleagues and that coworkers have, because there's always an angle that you're not considering. There's always something else that you're missing that you need to take into consideration.
Okay, of course there are some things that could impact you personally, and is there that project that is actually left a lasting impact on you personally?
Yeah, I think so I can think of a couple. When I was working in Tanzania with the Southern Tanzania Elephant Program, we started a football tournament called the Tembo Cup, where we worked in communities around game reserves that had a lot of human-elephant conflict. And so we created a big football tournament. We showed films, we did outreach in schools, and I worked on that tournament over the course of 3 years, and seeing it grow from something small to something really big that communities owned and took a lot of pride in was a really exciting and meaningful opportunity for communities to get connected to wildlife. I would say the work that we're doing here, the work that I'm a part of here in Boer South and Twitch East, is really exciting because chiefs and youth are really taking leadership on managing wildlife and making decisions about hunting. I find areas or projects where community members are telling me how they want things to go and are taking ownership and making decisions and moving ahead are the ones that are most exciting, because, again, the key to me from a project is ownership. Once communities feel something is theirs, that's when you can, step back and advise and guide, but that's what's going to really make something sustainable. So I would say any projects that I've been a part of where there's really been ownership, even if it's people arguing with me saying, we don't think it should be done this way, it should be done this way, that's a great sign of success, because it means that people think, no, this is mine, I want to take care of it, and I want to, and I think that's really what this is all about. I might have the perspective of bringing a new idea or of helping people see something that maybe they didn't see before. And then once that becomes something that they take on, then it can grow and fly.
Great. Looking ahead, what is your vision for conservation and community development in South Sudan over the next decade?
I would be so excited if we could grow the number of community conservancies in this country to put communities at the heart of conservation. I would love to see community conservancies in the key ecological areas around Jonglei State. I would love to see conservancies emerging in GPAA. I would love to see communities herding livestock alongside wildlife. I would be really excited to see communities implementing sustainable offtake, able to do community hunting in a sustainable way. I'd love to see our animal populations stay stable and start to increase. I'd love African parks to, reintroduce some of the key wildlife species that have disappeared from this landscape. I'd love us to bring zebra back. I'd love us to bring more buffalo back. And that is something that African parks can help to do, is translocate animals and restore populations. I think it would be really exciting. I'd love to create conditions for the elephants in the Great Nile Migration to feel safe and secure enough to start breeding again, so that we can see our populations increase. But mostly, I think I'd really love for communities to feel proud of the wildlife that we have in South Sudan and to be proud of their role in protecting it.
What gives you hope, and where do you see the potential, the greatest potential?
It's funny, I would say I see potential in the young people that I work with, but I also see potential in the older people that I work with. I'm lucky that I get to spend a lot of time with chiefs who have seen huge amounts of change and transformation in their landscapes that they work in. I'm hopeful when I talk to them and they continue to be positive. I'm also hopeful when I talk to them and they say like, oh, this challenge that you're facing right now, it's not that big of a deal. You'll be all right. You'll figure out a solution. So I'd say the big hope comes from the people, simultaneously the perspective of the elders that I work with, and then the intensity and optimism of the young people that I work with.
Oh, great. Finally, the message. What message would you like to leave with South Sudanese viewers and about protecting, nature while improving livelihoods?
I would say South Sudan has the opportunity to be the most innovative country for conservation on the continent, if not the world, by having communities take lead in protecting their wildlife, by having communities say, we want to be a part of protecting this wildlife. We want to benefit from this wildlife while stewarding it. And I think we can do that through community conservancies. We can do that through sustainable hunting. We can do that through establishing wildlife corridors. We can do that through making sure our linear infrastructure takes wildlife into account. But I think for communities to see this as an asset that can truly benefit them, I think, I remember talking to somebody in Twitch East who said how frustrated he was that everyday South Sudanese didn't benefit from oil. That we have this incredible natural resource in this country of oil, but that it doesn't reach the communities.
The people, yeah.
Wildlife can be the oil that benefits everyone if communities make decisions to protect it and steward it. And it can also be the thing that can change the story of South Sudan. When you Google South Sudan, right now it's a lot of stories about conflict. Imagine if you could Google it and it was stories about communities taking the lead on protecting their wildlife and communities benefiting from their wildlife. I truly believe that's possible, and that's why I'm here.
Wow, that's amazing. Of course, the most important thing here is, communities should actually take, wildlife as, their oil, of course, to benefit from. If you're not benefiting from the oil, then wildlife could actually possibly do that for you. And yes, let's have a rapid fire kind of questions. Coffee or tea?
Coffee, always.
Tanzania or South Sudan? And what has surprised you the most?
I have to say Tanzania because it's my home, but I'm really, really enjoying working in South Sudan.
Okay.
I'm always surprised by how tall people are. It continues to blow my mind.
Wow. One word that describes South Sudan.
Optimistic.
One leadership quality everyone should have.
Humility.
One book that inspired you.
The Beginner's Mind.
Biggest lesson from working in Africa.
Patience.
One place in South Sudan everyone should visit.
Jonglei.
If you were in a conversation, what career would you have chosen?
Cooking.
Oh, what motivates you every morning?
The potential of this place.
And then finally, a brief message to South Sudanese young people.
Take charge of your wildlife. It's yours, it's your right, and you can protect it.
And of course, we have come to the end of this beautiful conversation and with Emma that actually gave us too much from African Park and what you should understand about conservation and community development as well. And yes, thank you so much for viewing us wherever you're tuning in, and thank you if you are following us. Of course, Facebook is there. You can actually watch this at your own convenience, and also you can catch the repeat anytime. I think it will be repeated, and we will actually catch some most important questions and answers, and you will have them to have a better understanding. We would actually like to see your feedback on our comment section, and let's call it a wrap.
The game was on fire. Every pass, every goal, every second, unmissable. Then, blackout. But not all screens go dark. One app, one tap, changes everything. With My Home TV, the match never stops. live, anywhere, anytime. My Home TV. Your TV, always with you.